Hi, I'm Chris Wolfe, co-director of the Thomas International Center, welcoming you to our second class of our short course as part of our core curriculum course on American constitutional principles. And this short course is on the goals of government and the Declaration of Independence. We saw last class what the basic outline or structure of the Declaration was. And I want to turn now to a more close examination of the self-evident principles of the Declaration, because I think we'll find in them a concept of what exactly the founders thought government was all about and what we intend to achieve by establishing government. So let's begin at the beginning. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. I'm not sure whether the founders really meant self-evident in a kind of technical philosophical way. I mean, self-evidence normally means that as soon as you understand the terms of the proposition, then you understand that the proposition is true. I suspect that the founders meant it in a somewhat looser sense of self-evidence, that it's something that if people think about these things, they'll recognize fairly immediately the truth of them. And that first and foundational self-evident truth is all men are created equal. Equality is the foundation of American government. Not so much equality as a goal of government activity. We'll talk about that more later. But equality in our natures, equality in terms of the importance that each one of us has. And that's not an obvious thing. I mean, we Americans are we grow up, we're habituated to the idea that we're equal, and we assert it rather often. But in many other cultures, that would not be the case. In fact, many other cultures would say that inequality is the most obvious thing about human beings. First of all, just to take it from a surface level, look around you in society. Is it true that people in society are equal? Some people have a whole lot of money. Some people have very little money. Some people have a lot of power and influence. Other people have very little power or influence. I mean, it's so obvious that people are unequal that in one of the debates going up to the Civil War, a Southern congressman once commented, "The Declaration is a self-evident lie." It is the idea that people are equal. For a lot of people, the argument seems to be, inequality is what's primary. Well, the founders clearly did not mean that people are equal in wealth and power and influence, all those kinds of things. These things are conventional inequalities. That is, they're inequalities that are established by human beings themselves. And so if you kind of wash out those inequalities, what do you have left? Do you have equality? Well, even here, there are some pretty significant doubts, aren't there? There are so many ways in which people are naturally unequal. They're not just unequal because of what society does, but our very birthright. Take an obvious example. I often ask students, do you really think that people are naturally equal? If that's the case, then when you go out next Friday night, why don't we just draw lots to see who goes out with whom? Because after all, all young men and young women are equal, right? And so it doesn't really matter which one you go out with. Well, most of us probably didn't think that way. For one thing, we're influenced by the way people look. Some people are born beautiful. Some people are born not so beautiful. In fact, John Adams, I think at one point in his letters to Jefferson, comments about a particular family in Massachusetts, the Bowdens, who had a lot of influence, partly because they were just a really handsome family. They were kind of naturally gifted with physical beauty. And I think that's even true today, that you see that physical beauty can have an impact on people's standing in society. So certainly there are differences in, let's say, physical attractiveness. What about strength? Some people are really strong, some people are really weak. Some people are born with a lot of physical abilities, others with relatively little. So that's clearly something that's different. Intelligence, I mean, that's harder to say. There's a lot of arguments about that. But I think there is a pretty strong argument to be made that at least there's some component of intelligence that could be affected by simply heredity, by our biological heritage. And so there are lots of different ways in which it appears that we're not equal in all respects, even in terms of our natural endowments. So if that's the case, then what do the founders mean? Why isn't the Declaration a self-evident lie? I think the founders were actually pretty clear what they meant, because they went on right away to say all men are created equal, endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. That is, I think that what the founders meant is that everybody was equal in terms of rights. And that reflected a kind of basic natural equality, in the sense that we're all human beings who generally have the same faculties, the same abilities. I don't think it goes so far as one person suggested, which was that everybody must be pretty equal in intelligence, because so few people would want to trade their own intelligence for somebody else's. I don't think that's entirely true, but it's certainly true that human beings have so much more in common with each other than they do with any other kinds of creatures, because they share a common human nature. And there's a certain fundamental equality there. But it goes beyond just a fact. The question is, are human beings of equal worth? Does their well-being matter less or more than others? And I think when we talk about rights especially, we're arriving at the position where we say that in fundamental respects, the good of one person is no greater or lesser than the good of another person. Everybody should have the good, an opportunity to achieve the good. And so in that respect, in the fundamental respect that we're all of equal worth, that we all have certain fundamental equal rights, in that respect, we're equal. And that's the foundation for American government. So that's the first of the self-evident principles. What, however, might we say if somebody said, well, gee, the framers, the founders, are really a bunch of hypocrites? Because if you look at American society back at the time of the Declaration of Independence, it's simply not true that people were equal, even in terms of rights. If you define it more narrowly, not as involving, conventional properties like wealth or power, or natural properties like physical endowments and so forth. Even if you narrow the conception of equality to one of rights, is it true that all men were created equal in 1776? Look at the laws of America, and above all, perhaps, look at the big blot on the nation at the time, which was slavery. I mean, we had a whole class of people, a racial class, who were basically kept in subordination and simply used as means to benefit other people. And so people would say, well, we shouldn't take the founders too seriously, because, after all, there was slavery. And that means that the Declaration could only be a hugely hypocritical document. I don't think that's true. I think it's certainly true that there were a good number of people in the colonies, especially, although not exclusively, in the South, who believed that slavery was just a kind of fact of life, whether you liked it or not. It was something that was necessary, and you just couldn't do without it. And so we're going to hang on to it. And those people, I guess, to the extent that they said, all men are created equal, you'd have some doubts about their sincerity, about their honesty. But I think it's clear that a very large majority of the founders including many of the founders in southern states, including founders who had slaves, did very sincerely believe in the natural rights of man, in the natural equality of all human beings, including slaves. That's certainly true, I think, of Jefferson, who wrote the Declaration, and in fact, who included a long passage in the Declaration stridently condemning the slave trade. Now, it's true that Jefferson owned slaves, and maybe we would conclude, after looking closely at his life, that he should have acted more consistently with his principles, that he should have freed his slaves. It's not an obviously easy question. There's certainly a possibility that simply freeing the slaves at that time would not have left the slaves in a very good condition. They would have been freed, but in a society where there was a lot of racial animus. They would be, many of them, unprepared to really support themselves. And so you can understand why there might be at least some short-term considerations counseling a gradual elimination of slavery over time, which is, I think, what Jefferson and some of the other Southern founders especially would have said. In the North, I think there was a wider spread opposition to slavery, although it's worthwhile remembering, as Lincoln recalled, that the history of slavery in America involved a lot of traders in New England making a lot of money bringing slaves to the New World. Still, there was, I think, a commitment to the idea that all men, including slaves, are naturally equal. The question is, how do you get from where we are to a situation which effectively recognizes that equality? And that was a tough question. In a way, the threshold question for a lot of the founders, especially for those who were opposed to slavery and would have eliminated it sooner rather than later, is what do we do when we have this group of colonies, 13 colonies, where a portion of them, the southern ones especially, are committed to a way of life that is dependent on slavery? You could actually go in two different directions, right? I mean, you could say, hey, listen, slavery is unjust, so we're just not going to have anything to do with slavery. And if that means that we have to go off on our own and not act politically united to the southern states, then so be it. We'll have maybe 2 or 3 different confederations, but at least we, let's say in the North or in the Middle States, are going to act according to our principles, and we're not going to allow slavery. We're not going to connive in a document that tolerates slavery. The alternative would be what? Well, I guess you could view it 2 different ways. One would be, you could say, well, we'll tolerate slavery because of the importance of union. And I think that's clearly what the majority of the founders decided, and again, especially those from the North and the Middle States who were opposed to slavery. They would have said something like this, and look at the first section of the Federalist Papers written in 1787-88, about 10 years after the Declaration, when we were considering precisely the question of whether or not to ratify the new Constitution. And the first section of the Federalist Papers focuses on this question: how important is the Union? Is it really essential that we maintain the Union, or would we be better off with 2 or 3 different confederations? The Federalist makes a very powerful argument that maintaining the Union is extremely important for a variety of reasons. One is to be stronger when we're facing foreign enemies. Another is to avoid the potential for warfare among the different confederations if you did split up into a number of confederations. And the founders in general were really convinced that the well-being of America in the long run depended on union. That still leaves a second question. What price are you willing to pay for union? Are you willing to simply accept the injustice of slavery indefinitely as a necessary, unfortunate, but inevitable price to pay for having the Union? I don't know if the founders would have accepted that particular price. I genuinely don't know. We'll never know, because I think what their position was something different. That position was this: we do have to accept slavery in the short term, but in the long term, slavery has to be extinguished, and in fact, it's on the way to being extinguished. And as I think Lincoln makes a persuasive argument when he goes back and looks at the founders, analyzes their statements, their different positions, and he argues that by and large the founders believed that slavery was unjust, and they thought that it was ultimately going to be extinguished. Now, why would they think that? Why would they assume that slavery would ultimately be extinguished? A couple of factors, I think. One is just raw economic considerations. Ultimately, slave labor is inferior to free labor. If you want to actually be productive, you'd rather have free labor than slave labor. Somebody might say, well, you can't beat the price of slaves, right? Because they're free. Well, of course, they're not free. You have to sustain them. You have to keep them alive if they're going to work for you. But more importantly, you have to think about the whole question of motivation. And here I think we should compare the United States perhaps with the Soviet Union. Why was it that the Soviet Union ultimately fell apart? Well, it's complex, of course. There are various reasons. But one reason is that they were simply less economically productive. And why were they less economically productive? Because in many ways what they had was a kind of slave labor. People didn't really have the freedom to pursue their own economic goals, which provides, of course, a great incentive to work hard when you're actually going to pursue the goal that you've chosen, and you'll get the fruits of those goals. Okay? So that was one factor that the framers led the framers to conclude that eventually slavery would die out. It's simply economically inefficient. Second, the framers thought that they were on the leading edge of a kind of enlightenment among human beings, that more and more people were coming to understand and accept the rights of man, to accept the self-evident principles of the Declaration. And as those principles spread throughout society, people would see more and more clearly that slavery was unjust and be more and more willing to do what was necessary to get rid of it. It would take time, of course, but the framers did think that, just as a kind of prediction of the future, that slavery would ultimately die out. As it turns out, the framers were simply too optimistic in this respect. I think they underestimated the extent to which some people, especially in the South, would cling to a way of life that was less economically efficient, less productive, because they valued the way of life more than, let's say, the amount of money that they had. Of course, it also affected things that the cotton gin was invented, and that in some ways slave labor became more economically efficient after the 1790s than it might have been beforehand. At any rate, the framers were optimistic, as it turns out, and they didn't anticipate that rather than the spread of the rights of man, there would build up in the South an ideology that was strongly committed to inequality, especially the inequality of the black race, of the slaves. And that ultimately, of course, meant that the issue was going to be resolved in the Civil War. Okay, so coming back to the Declaration then, I do think the framers, the vast majority of them, not every one of them perhaps, but I do think the framers of our government, the founders of American government, did believe that all men, including slaves, were naturally equal. But what they thought is that that was going to be something that would have to be achieved over time, that it was an essential, a necessary goal of society and whether the society was just would turn partly on this question of, is it making progress toward equality, toward getting rid of the inequality that was unjust? That's the goal of every decent society, they thought. Again, this is Lincoln's argument, and I think he's persuasive about that. What about other kinds of inequality at the time of the founding? You could talk about economic inequality. Some people had more money than other people, but of course that's not necessarily a question of rights. At least some kinds of differences in economic status might be perfectly legitimate. I mean, some people work really hard and are really good at what they're doing. They might earn more, and in general, that kind of inequality the framers didn't object to. We'll come back and talk about that more later on in one of the future short courses. What about gender equality? This is something that bothers a lot of people today. There's no question that there was significant gender inequality of, for example, political rights. In general, at the time of the founding, it was only certain males, even some males, in some states, males with certain property qualifications, that had the right to vote. And so people say, well, did that mean that the founders did not believe in the natural equality of women, of their wives and their daughters? Again, I don't think that's the case. I think if you would ask the founders, are all men, that is, all human beings, naturally equal in rights, natural rights, they would have said yes, and they would have said that includes women and not just men. I think that what the social arrangements of the time were determined by was a certain conception of the family, and especially a kind of division of labor in the family between men who handled more external things and men and women who handled things within the family. There are a lot of questions about that, and it may be that that was wrong at the time, or it may be that it became wrong. I mean, that's a huge issue, and again, we'll talk about that later on in the short course, the fourth one that deals with changing purposes of American government. But what I want to say, at least for the time being, is that I don't think that the founders can be said to be simply hypocritical, that they said that women were equal in natural rights, but in fact didn't really believe that. I think it's clear that they really did believe it, but they had a different conception of how natural rights ought to play out in terms of legal and political rights. And as I say, that's an issue we'll come back to. But I don't think it's a simple question of hypocrisy. So this is the first of the self-evident principles of the Declaration. All men are created equal. It's hard for us even to understand how important and how radical that principle was for the time. There had been political theorists who had talked about that before, but here you have a new form of government being established, and the very first principle it lays down is this principle of equality. And we take that for granted nowadays. I mean, equality is something we breathe in from the time we're young. And in a way, inequality is always in a position where it has to justify itself. Before the Declaration, before American government, most other political communities in human history, really all other political communities, I think, if you take into consideration that even Greek democracies had 90% slaves, those political communities really started from the assumption of inequality. Some interesting passages in Alexis de Tocqueville's Democracy in America about this. He has a citation of some letters of an aristocratic woman who he says is a very nice woman. She's a loving mother and a decent person. And yet she writes these letters where she describes peasants being visited with terrible punishments, awful punishments, and talks about them rather lightly. And Tocqueville comments that in the ancien regime, in the old government, in aristocratic governments, that the classes were so different that the aristocrats and the peasants were hardly able really to even think in each other's shoes. That an aristocrat couldn't imagine, well, gee, what if I were a peasant? How would I feel about that? the peasants were just almost a kind of a different form of life in some ways. They were human, but they were somehow so different that they really weren't kind of one of us, one of the kinds of people that we can, get into the shoes of and understand, what their position in life is. And likewise with the peasants. The aristocrat to the peasant was just on the other side of the moon, not somebody he could even imagine being. And that was true of so many different cultures in different ways. I mean, Tocqueville's talking about the France of the Ancien Regime. But it's true, I think, throughout the world that there's a very large measure of inequality from nation to nation. In other societies throughout human history, the differences between different parts of society are so great that natural inequality is somehow the most salient fact of political life. And so when the framers put all men are created equal as the first of the self-evident truths, that really was a kind of major point in human history, that you have a government formally established on the basis of this ideal of equality. And so we should try to recall how important that is and not just take it for granted ourselves. In next class, we'll turn to the second self-evident principle, which is precisely what we're equal in. That's this idea of rights, that we're all endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights. Until then, so long.